Hello everyone, my name is Alex. I'm a 2000 rated chess player, and in this series I'm going from 1000 to 2000 ELO on a speedrun account on chess.com Rapid, with the intention of trying to explain my thought process as best as I possibly can for your entertainment and education. So let's get straight into it. We have a Caro Kann defense. This is one of my favorite openings ever, and with the black pieces, I played against pretty much everything. I have a playlist linked below with the previous episodes of this speedrun and every game on my channel featuring the Caro Kann. And as I have said in the previous episodes, down at this sort of rating, everybody seems to play the move e5 against the Caro Kann. And it makes sense. As somebody in my comment section pointed out, people see that they can play e5 and c3 and create this big pawn chain in the center, and they see a big pawn chain and they go, oh, that must be really good. We're going to go and try and chip away at that pawn chain immediately with the move c5. Technically, this is a sacrifice of a pawn, and white can take our pawn on c5. But he doesn't. Everybody plays the move c3. Like I said, people want to make a massive pawn chain because I guess they win Connect 4 and they've been watching too much Gotham chess. We're going to play the move knight to c6, and a lot of people play knight to f3, which is a bad move, and I will explain why. Well, I'll explain why anyway, regardless of whether he plays it or not. The move knight to f3 allows me to take on d4, and the issue is, knight f3, cd4, he does it, cd4, my opponent cannot take with the knight because I will take the pawn on e5. And there's no tricks with bishop b5 checks or anything because I have moves like bishop to d7. You have to take back with the pawn. And this is the issue. I break apart the pawn chain very quickly, and this d4 pawn is a lot weaker than it looks. Now, how can we increase the intensity of attack against the d4 pawn? We're currently attacking it once, it's defended twice. Well, we could add another attacker with queen to b6, but typically you don't develop your queen quite this early in the game. Better is to move bishop to g4. Instead of adding another attacker, we instead immobilize one of the defenders. At any point, we could take the knight on f3 and remove a defender of the d4 pawn. Now, there's no point doing it now because after takes, there is a defender, we only have one attacker, so we won't be winning any pawns anytime soon. We're going to play the move e6, and this is kind of the ideal setup for the Caro Kann. I think maybe a week ago, at the point of this video releasing, I have a video called like the perfect Caro Kann setup, where what we do is we rotate this knight from g8 to e7 into f5, put the bishop on e7 and castle. And the point is, if this knight can make it to f5, it targets the pawn on d4. The bishop on e7 is very good at monitoring our weak dark squares, because of course we're putting a lot of pawns on light squares. And this knight puts pressure on d4. This bishop puts pressure on the knight, which defends d4. The queen can come to b6 to put more pressure on d4. And if d4 falls, e5 will probably follow. And we will probably win the game. That's kind of what the goal is in the Caro Kann advanced variation if your opponent goes for this c3 line, which if you're below 1500 or even 1800, most people go for. My opponent plays a3. It stops anything from coming to b4, but we weren't going to put anything on b4 anyway. He may be trying to go b4 to play b5, but we will just play a6 against that, and my opponent will be wasting his time. So we're going to go knight g to e7. If h3 ever gets played in these lines, you can retreat to h5. Sometimes it's good to retreat to h5, and sometimes it's good to take the knight. Now, what we don't want to do is take the knight without being prompted by the move h3 most of the time, because typically we want white to play h3 so that he wastes a move asking us to take. If we take without white asking us, maybe we're like down a move, kind of. h3 is played, and now we have to make a choice. Do we want to take on f3 or not? Now, what happens if we retreat to h5? That's the question, because we can always go back and take. So, if bishop h5, can white play g4? That's what we should be asking here. g4, bishop g6. Okay, white has weakened his kingside pretty significantly. We have moves like h5 on the way. But bishop h5, g4, bishop to g6, there is knight to h4 going after the bishop, which is a little bit annoying because there's no way for us to save the bishop. If we put the bishop on e4, white will just play f3. So maybe we don't want to do that. Maybe we don't want to do that. Although there might be tactics with knight to g6 and opening up the queen on h4 because that would be a checking square. Maybe. Now, what happens if we take? Well, bishop takes f3, bishop takes f3, knight to f5 threatens to win the d4 pawn. Because we have two defenders, we have two attackers, white has one defender. So take, knight f5. How can my opponent defend? He can play bishop to e3, but bishop to e3 seems to lose the game because of knight takes e3, pawn takes e3, queen h4 check. The problem with h3 is that white can no longer play g3, and if the f pawn takes on e3, that diagonal is exposed. My opponent won't be able to castle, and we should have a pretty comfortable game from there on. Okay, so if takes knight f5, my opponent can't play bishop to e3. What can he do? I honestly don't know. I don't know how he defends his pawn, and we can add another attacker with the move queen to b6 if we so desire. So I really like this plan. We're going to take. Bishop takes, is the only move that makes any real sense. You could take with the g-pawn, I suppose, but knight to f5 holds all the same threats, and bishop e3 takes, queen to h4 can be played all the same. My opponent has disconnected. I really hope he doesn't abandon this game. That would be really unfortunate. But okay. Bishop f3, knight f5. What can we do? What can we do? Well, no, what can my opponent do? Maybe he can castle and gambit this pawn somehow. I'd probably take with the f knight so that the knight on c6 maintains pressure on the e5 pawn. Also just blocks this diagonal off for any potential checks. We're kind of threatening to take the bishop, and at the end of the day, we're just up a pawn. So that seems pretty damn good to me. By the way, if you're enjoying this video so far and haven't already, I would really appreciate it if you could drop a like and subscribe. It really helps to motivate me to keep making these YouTube videos, which I have been really enjoying recently. I unfortunately have a bit of a feeling that my opponent is going to abandon this game because maybe he's realized that he doesn't have a counter for knight to f5. Although this would feel like a very premature resignation. So I'm going to pause my recording and I'll resume it once we know what's going on. Okay, so my opponent did abandon the game, so I will do a very brief analysis of this and then jump into a second game. So, 98.7% accuracy. It was obviously a short game because I know this opening inside out, which is why I'm explaining it to you guys. This is the Caro Kann, advanced variation, c5. The most testing line, I would say, is to take on c5 with white. Black can choose either knight c6 going after the e5 pawn or e6 going after the c5 pawn. Things get kind of complicated, but most people don't go into this with the white pieces. Most people play knight to f3 defending their center or c3 defending their center. My opponent chooses c3. We go knight c6. My opponent goes knight to f3, which is not a good move. You can see the eval bar jump there. Better is something like bishop b5, pinning my knight. But my opponent chooses knight f3. We take on d4, and like I said, knight takes d4 is not playable because of knight takes e5. And a move like bishop to b5 check is easily countered with the move bishop to d7. And, something like takes, queen takes, black is up a clean pawn with a very comfortable position. So c takes d4 has to be played. Bishop g4 pins the knight to the queen. And bishop e2 is a good move from my opponent. We go e6, just opening up our bishop and preparing knight to e7, knight g to e7, knight to f5. We don't really want to go via h6 by going like knight h6 here to try and go knight f5, because my opponent will just take and ruin my pawn structure, which is not good. We need that knight. So e6, a3 doesn't really make any sense. The computer actually wants to take on f3 straight away and just go queen to b6 going after the pawn, and if bishop e3, just gobble the b2 pawn. But I have mentioned this in a few previous videos, although a lot of the time in this opening you can go queen b6 and win the b2 pawn by baiting the bishop to e3. It can be actually quite tricky to not just get completely demolished here with the black pieces because of like rook b1, rook b7 stuff that you can't really stop. So I wouldn't recommend it, especially with the weakness of this diagonal. Personally, I think the way that I went about the position with knight g to e7 is actually better than the computer recommendation on a practical level. If you disagree with me, let me know, but that's my personal opinion. My opponent then follows up with h3, which just isn't the way to go. Now you could play bishop to h5, and after g4, bishop to g6. I didn't think that knight to h4 worked. I was going to go bishop e4, and after f3 I thought I might have tactics with knight g6, but the computer thinks I can take on b1, and then go queen b6, and I guess it's just really hard to defend the d4 square. Something like bishop to e3. Ah, okay, you remove the defender of the bishop by forcing the pawn forward. That makes sense. But it's better just to take, and my opponent here abandons the game, but the point is, bishop takes f3, we have knight to f5 or queen to b6. They're both basically the same evaluation, but knight f5, you can't defend this pawn, and if you do go bishop e3, then I was actually going to do this and queen h4 check, which is very good, don't get me wrong, but better still is just queen b6. Just going after the material. Let me know what you would have done there. Would you have gone for the line I suggested with here, here, and giving this check? Or would you have applied more pressure? Because to be fair, white can't defend both of these pawns properly. Personally, I think I would have gone for the checking line, just because I like attacking in that kind of way. I think my opponent probably would have crumbled under the pressure. But let's jump into a second game that will hopefully be a longer one. Okay, here we have a game against a 1500 rated opponent, so our hardest opponent of the series so far. And we have a Sicilian Defense. Now, in the previous video, we faced a Sicilian Defense in the first game, and we went for this a3 line, which I really, really like. It's very tricky for black to play against, and there's a lot of Gambit lines. Now, d6 doesn't allow us to play a proper Gambit, but if you do want to see the Gambit lines, then make sure you check out the playlist that will be linked below, with every game I've played on this channel in the a3 Sicilian. If your opponent does play a move like d6 here, and you can't go for the Gambit lines of b4, then knight to c3 is the typical follow-up. a6 is an interesting move, because typically I put my bishop on c4, and I guess b5 isn't actually a problem, because bishop to d5, surely that's annoying for black, because you have to go rook to a7. Although I suppose if bishop c4, b5, and bishop to a2, that's also fine. And we may even have tactics of like e5, followed by queen to f3 with a fork. That could be really interesting. Let's play bishop c4. I think those lines probably work out in my favor. Wait. Can't we go bishop to f7? Bishop f7, king f7, queen h5 check. Either the king comes to f6, and after check here, he is mated. Bishop f7, king f7, queen h5 check g6, queen d5 check, picking up the rook. I've never played this trap before. I've never seen this before. But the king can't retreat. Either he comes forward and gets mated, or he comes forward and gets mated, or he plays g6 and loses a rook. Lads, I have never played this ever, this trap before. This is not opening prep, but I've never seen this played before. And yeah, the power of the a3 Sicilian. Wow. I guess this is why you don't just push pawns aimlessly in the opening. I mean, I suppose it wasn't aimless. Like, there was a point behind the pawn moves, but you've got to develop your pieces. If my opponent had a knight on f6, for example, none of this would have been possible, because queen h5 check wouldn't have been playable. Or if his pawn was on e6 to develop his queen and bishop, then the diagonal would have been blocked off. The issue is he's focused all his effort on developing his queenside pawns, and he's now down the exchange, down a pawn, and cannot castle. And there is no way that my queen is getting trapped here. Absolutely no way it's getting trapped. I refuse to believe that that is a possibility. Knight f3 is probably my next move, preparing the move knight to g5, which would be very annoying for black, because he'd probably have to bring his king even further out. So let's go knight to f3. This pawn is very well defended by our queen and our knight. And I mean, I suppose our queen can't really get out of my opponent's territory just yet, but it's in no danger of getting trapped. Also, moves like e5 probably exist. I think he's trying to go knight to b6 to trap my queen, but it doesn't work because of knight to g5 check. King to f6 is pretty much forced to defend the bishop. Then I can take the bishop, and you can't go knight to b6 because your queen is hanging. And after king takes, I will play queen to d5. The king will have to go to f6, and we'll probably play the move d4. Check, probably d4 to open up my bishop to get to the g5 square. There's lots of different things we could do here. We could even just go d3 and be very calm about this. But currently we are up an exchange and a pawn still. And my opponent's king is stuck on f6 with a very difficult time trying to return home. I suppose d4 stops knight to e5, which would cut the connection between the pieces. If pawn d4 take check here, we don't actually carry a threat. I mean, we can take on d4, but something like e5, I suppose. But then we do manufacture a way for our queen to escape, because I suppose a move like e6 is still annoying, because our queen would have to go back into my opponent's territory, and I would prefer to get it away home, like to get away home. Maybe h4, trying to play queen to g5 check and bring the queen back to square like g3. The only thing we have to do now is consolidate our position by not losing our queen. Also, if we move our queen, we get the d5 square for the knight, I suppose. If d3, pawn e6... Well, no, we can just give a check with our queen. Also, this pawn can't move because he'd lose his queen. d4 is any better? Well, d4 stops our queen from being blocked off by a knight, let's say. So if d4 takes... I suppose we can just go check here, check. And move like e5, we just play queen d2. Bishop h6 check, exchanging bishops is kind of threatened. So yeah, let's go d4. Could you argue that I'm spending unnecessary time on this move? Maybe, but I would disagree, because why would we want to give our opponent anything in this position? Just keep things nice and simple. I want to not just beat my opponent, but I want to crush my opponent, not give them a single sliver of hope, right? At least that's the way that I play chess. I want to really win. Bishop g5 check I will throw in first, because this is a very nice square for the bishop. Also pins the pawn to the queen, and means that the e-pawn cannot move, which my opponent probably would want to do, because after the move king to g7, he cannot develop his bishop, because this pawn can't move and the bishop can't get out this way. Let's take on d4 with check. If my opponent does go pawn to e5, my bishop is technically under attack and my queen is under attack, but we could probably have taken on e5 with the queen and then taken his queen and got a pawn and a queen trade at the same time. Knight to f6, you might be tempted to take the knight, but why take the knight just yet? The knight is not going anywhere, it's pinned, and if e5 is played breaking the pin, then it's pinned another way. So I propose that we just castle queenside. Although the move e5 is very good, actually, because you can't take because the queen hangs. So if e5, you have to move the knight to save the knight, and if knight to d7, let's say, then we take on a d6 with discovered check. So let's do that instead. If we go pawn e5 and knight to c6, attacking the queen and the pawn, take on f6, and if f takes, sorry, if e takes f6, our bishop and our queen are both under attack. But we do have the move queen to d5, attacking the knight. And if the knight drops back to e7, attacking our queen, our bishop is still under attack. Then I think we figure it out. I think we'll figure it out. Let's play the move e5. I mean, the very worst case scenario is I win a piece and have to give the piece back. That is basically just getting more trades on the board, and more trades is better for us because we are, again, up an exchange and a pawn. Don't give your opponent anything just because you're better in this position. Don't automatically castle queenside or castle kingside, or play a move like knight d5 because it looks aesthetic. Don't play moves just because they look nice or because you're on autopilot. No matter how winning you are, you don't want to be throwing away games that you're completely winning because you're being lazy. Don't be lazy. Play the game properly. Calculate. Now, e6 is also a move we could play. And the knight would have to return to f6 because it would be check. And it would also get him out of the attack. And the pawn on e6 is useful because this e-pawn can't move, which restricts this bishop even further. But the e-pawn can't move anyway because it's pinned to the queen. So if we take on d6 and knight to f6, maybe then we castle queenside. Because if the pawn ever takes, we can probably just trade everything on f6. I like that, let's do it. I think this way we probably win another pawn. Now, after knight to f6, do not d takes e7 and lose your queen. That would be a little bit silly. We can consider the move knight e4, attacking the knight. And then the pawn can't take because we just win a piece. If knight c6, we can play take. That seems overcomplicated. Let's just queenside castle. Let's queenside castle. If knight c6 gets played, which is what I'm expecting, probably just queen to f4. Or maybe... Yeah, I think queen f4, although my opponent could play knight to h5. Maybe that's a little bit annoying. We could take, and after pawn takes, play a move like queen e4 attacking the knight. The knight could come to e5. We could play f4 attacking. The knight could go to c4. And then it's kind of annoying on c4, actually. Kind of annoying, so I don't want to take this knight and allow the knight into e5 and c4. Again, we're completely winning, but I don't want to give my opponent a single sliver of hope. We could consider the move queen to c5, because there is no knight e4. And we keep an eye on this pawn, we attack the knight. I think I like that move. That's it. We have a lot of pressure in this position. My next move is probably rook h to e1 to get our final piece involved in the action. Also not clear how black defends himself here, because if he plays a move like queen to c8, defending the knight, I think we can play bishop f6, ef6, and d7. The queen would have to go to c7 to keep defending the knight. And then we could just promote, and either the knight takes and we win the queen, or the queen takes and we win the knight. So again, I think we're keeping things incredibly accurate right now. The only thing we do have to consider is if here, my opponent can give a check on the f4 square to potentially get out of immediate danger. Although there we would have moves like queen to e3, and if takes, knight to d8 blocking the promotion. does exist. My opponent goes knight a5. He's maybe coming to, but this doesn't threaten anything. Maybe he's trying to go to b7 to fork me. What do we do? What do we do? Well, rook he1, knight b7. We do have queen c7 there. Although, oh no, we can't take because that'll be pinned. We could play queen c7 immediately and offer a queen trade, because if takes, black has no way of stopping the promotion, because this knight can't help and the bishop can't move out of the way for the rook to help. And if we do play this move, which I am going to play, the queen is also under attack because the queen can't take, and the knight is under attack. We're also pinning this pawn to the king, so that if we take the knight, the king would have to take, which is pretty exposing. I think we are playing this very, very accurately, and I hope this is really instructive for those of you watching. That is the goal of these videos, to really try and help you guys improve your chess. My opponent takes, I will take back, and none of these pieces can stop my pawn from promoting. Absolutely none of them. My opponent resigns. Let's get into an analysis of this game, and then I think we'll play a third game. Why not? Why not? So, considering this game was 21 moves long, a 91.9% accuracy score is very, very nice. I'm very happy with that, considering how complicated things were. But let's see what the computer thinks, because I don't know if my sacrifice actually worked. e4, c5, a3. Now, the Gambit lines follow after like knight c6, b4, takes, c3, knight c6, d4. That's the idea of the Gambit. My opponent doesn't allow it by playing the move d6. We go knight c3, a6, bishop c4, b5, and this is a mistake. Now, interestingly, my opponent is supposed to allow my queen to do this, not block with the bishop, but block with the pawn, and after queen a8, play queen c7, which does actually threaten the move bishop b7, although we would have the a7 square, but then knight to c6. So the best move for me is knight d5, counter-attacking the queen, ed5, queen d5, then bishop e6, and then we move the queen, and we get a rook and two pawns for a bishop and a knight. My opponent can't castle, but he has good development, although his king is exposed. This would be a very interesting position to play, and I might actually use this in my games normally. I know that it looks pretty bad, like bishop h6 looks bad, but my pawns are very solid. There's no obvious way for black to take advantage of this. Like knight c6, knight e2 stopping knight d4, knight f6, d3. If my opponent trades, then it's back to equal. And, you know, kingside castle f4, f5 looks very, very enticing. I think this is quite difficult to play with the black pieces. But my opponent chooses the wrong move with bishop e6, because after queen takes a8, there is no hope of trapping my queen anymore. Knight f6, knight f3 is the best move, threatening knight to g5 check. Here it would be a threat, because let's just say my opponent plays queen c7. Knight g5 check, the king can't go to f6 to defend the bishop, so I get a bishop for free, and it's actually really, really bad. So my opponent goes knight f to d7, which makes sense, because you give the king this square, and you also have ideas of knight to b6. Better was h6, just stopping my knight from coming in altogether, but he chooses wrong. Knight g5 check, the king moves up the board. Whoa, e5 is the best move. What? Is it trying to get the queen back like this? If king takes, there's got to be some kind of mate, I assume. Here. Oh, yeah, you're just getting hunted out. d4. Yeah, that's game over. Game over. Okay, what if the knight takes? Knight c to e4 check. Ah, the king can't go back to g7 because I win the bishop. You can't go back to f7 because I control that square. You have to come forward. And then h3, intending to play g4, forcing the king forward, and then playing d4 with a check, which would be mate. That's crazy. I didn't see that, of course. I just took the bishop, which is still completely winning. I get my queen out, king f6, d4 is the best move, alongside d3. cd4, bishop g5, king g7, take on d4 with check, knight f6 is played, and we play the move e5, which keeps the pressure on. We could play a move like queenside castle, but it's not as testing for black. We have one, two, three attacking pieces right now. The pawn is a fourth. We have a lot of pins and tactics going everywhere, and his king is exposed. We should just go for it. Taking on d6 is best. I did consider the move e6 check, knight f6. This is an annoying pawn for my opponent to deal with. After knight d5, knight c6, take. We do have queen c3, attacking some different things, maybe ideas of e7 coming in. You can't play knight to e7 because I will take on f6 and follow up with mate, or if you come out this way, there's probably some other kind of mate on the horizon. But I decide to take on d6, which is a bit better. Knight goes back to f6, we queenside castle, which is the best move, so again, I'm very happy I found that. Knight c6, queen c5 is the best idea. I considered things like queen f4, but I was like, maybe this can be played. You can also take here, whereas if we actually threaten our opponent, he can't take because I will take. So he has to do something. He chooses knight a5, not the best. I was expecting queen c8, and my plan was bishop f6, ef6, and d7. Oh, that hangs a queen. I probably would have seen that had it actually happened, but that's hilarious. Even so, I mean, I'm still winning. Because I'm just up an exchange and a pawn, and the king is very exposed. Rook d7 is a big issue. But my opponent chooses knight a5. And queen c7 is the best move. Now, of course, you could play a move like rook h to e1, which is the second best move, but then e takes d6. And yeah, you can give this check. Black can try and defend himself. You're winning, but it's not quite as winning as what we went for with queen to c7, because if you take, you see what happens here. There is no way to stop the promotion. Even though you have 4 pieces, you can't stop the promotion. So you can't take. What can you do? You can't take on d6, because I will take your queen. The queen is undefended. If you try and save the queen with a move like queen a8, I can take on a5, or I can take on e7. The bishop is trapped. I'm also threatening promotion with check. Really bad stuff. Also, rook d8 exists. And this hangs, and this hangs, and this hangs. It's bad. My opponent takes, we take back, we're going to promote, there's nothing he can do about it, and the game is over. Very interesting game, though. Let's get into a third game. We are getting, like, 3 of my favourite openings in the same video. We've had a Caro Kann, we've had an A3 Sicilian, and now we have a Vienna. The Vienna is a fantastic opening. It is very difficult for black to deal with. There's lots of hidden traps, etc. But even if you don't get to play any of the really aggressive or trappy lines, it's just a nice solid opening. But my opponent goes for f6, which allows us to play the Vienna Gambit. So 2 Gambits in one video, although unfortunately last game we didn't actually get to play the Gambit. You can't take this pawn. I have a whole playlist, linked down below, dedicated to every Vienna game I have on the channel. So if you want to learn more about the Vienna, make sure you check that out at the end of the video. But e takes f4 is not a good move because of e5. The knight cannot advance at all because we control all of its advancing squares. So it has to go back to g8. Now, a common thing that players with black do here, once they realise, oh, my knight's under attack, and I don't want to undevelop it, is they play queen e7. Queen e7 looks logical, but it's really bad. This position is like plus 0.9. Queen e7 is about plus 2. Reason being that after queen e7, you just go queen e2. You defend the pawn, you unpin the pawn from the king, and the knight still can't advance forward because you still control these squares. So after queen e7, queen e2, the knight has to go back to g8, and that's an even worse version of the knight just going back to g8 immediately, because the inclusion of these moves stops black from developing his dark square bishop, which means it's difficult for him to castle. Also, the knight has to go to g8, so it no longer controls the d5 square. So there is the looming threat of knight to d5 the whole time, attacking the queen and attacking the c7 square. Now, most of the time, you don't actually play the move knight to d5. You just have it in your back pocket if you want it. My opponent's sensible. He drops the knight back. And don't do something like bishop c4 here, because queen to h4 check, you can't go g3 because of takes, and whoops, your bishop's under attack, and you can't take back because whoops, your rook is under attack. There is actually a line where you do go bishop c4, queen h4, and king to f1 that's very similar to some king's gambit lines. The idea is you give up castling, but you're going to play knight to f3 with tempo on the queen, and you're going to attack your opponent. Personally, I prefer knight to f3 immediately. Just stopping all of these shenanigans, we have bishop to e7, and we might get to play one of the coolest lines I have ever seen. In a video that must have been about a week old by now, we had a game where my opponent went, yes, he went bishop to h4 check. The point is, you can't take because of queen takes, and you have the same issue that I described earlier, where you can't go g3 because of takes and the bishop is under attack, and if you take like the rook is hanging as well, it's really, really bad. What you can actually do in this position, if I remember correctly, you can play g3. Takes, bishop takes, play king f1, and the bishop on g3 is completely trapped. I think. Although, that might be... Maybe that's in d4 lines, actually. That might be in lines with d4, because it stops bishop to f4. Let me calculate this. I might have mixed it up. g3 takes here. What about bishop to f4? Because then he can get away to h6. Yeah, no, it's lines with d4 already in them. Because then the bishop can take... Sorry, the bishop controls the f4 square. That's the difference. So here. And that doesn't work. Moves like knight d5 don't do anything. The bishop just drops back, and this is defended. So here we have to go king to f1. Is it ideal? No. Maybe king e2... Oh no, king e2 isn't better. What am I on about? King f1. Which isn't the end of the world, actually. It might look really bad because we can't castle. This rook might struggle to get out. But it's not actually that bad. We're going to play moves like d4. We're going to win the f4 pawn back, most likely. And we're going to build an initiative against my opponent. This bishop did its job, but it's vulnerable. It's just hanging. I can take it at any point. And the queen needs to maintain defense of the bishop. You know, there are ideas of like knight to d5, for example, which threatens knight h4 because if queen h4, the queen takes her eyes off of the c7 pawn. Now, will my opponent fall for that? Probably not, but it's worth keeping in the back of your mind. Now, let me just have a quick think. The bishop may drop back to e7. It does. Okay, that was a really good call. And I think we're just going to play d4. This is kind of the plan. And yes, we cannot castle. But look at my development. Look at my opponent's development. d6 is played, and I think we just take on f4. Now, you never take. You never take. Actually, if here... I can't take with the pawn because my opponent trades queens. Technically, I can do that. It is equal material because I'll be winning my pawn back. But I don't think I want to. Although, actually, bishop f4, take. Knight d5 is a threat. Because you can't defend c7, because knight a6 I take the knight. And you can't play knight f6 to stop knight d5, because the e5 pawn controls that square. So here. My opponent has one move to try and stop me. He could go bishop e6. And if take, knight b5, knight a6. Although the position's still great. Still a great position. Can we go queen e2 though? That's the question. With the idea being if takes takes, we will take on f4 and play rook d1 with tempo on the queen. To me, that seems better. Now, if queen e2, bishop g4, is that annoying? A little bit. But if take, I don't think we have any issues. If my opponent takes, I'll just take back. Equal material. I've got an advantage in development. But honestly, I think bishop f4, take. I don't mind this queen trade because my king can't castle, right? That is the only problem with my position. That's the only issue. However, if the queens come off the board, who cares if my king can't castle? Who cares? Because my opponent has no way of attacking my king because he has no queen. Bishop g4, I think, ignores this threat. He does have bishop d8, which I admittedly missed. I admittedly missed that. It does give him the e7 square for the knight, which he wants to do anyway. So maybe I just go king f2. If bishop to c5 check, the move king to g3 is quite nice, putting pressure on the bishop. Because the queens are off the board and my pieces are so active, I don't mind if my king is a little bit exposed. I'm also preparing the move rook e1 there, or maybe doubling up and putting the rook on d1. Let's see, is there anything else? Is there anything else that I should consider? So we know these ideas don't work. I don't want to move this knight and hang my rook, of course. We could play h3. I don't really want to take with the pawn, I don't think. Let's play king f2. I like this idea. We're just getting ready to develop even quicker. And it's a comfortable position. It's a comfortable position. We have the perfect setup of minor pieces. This is like commonly known to be the perfect setup to control the center, because I mean they do control the center incredibly well. We have eyes on the weak squares. Yeah, bishop c5 is natural, but king g3. And if you take, maybe then I take back with the pawn. No, do I want to take with the king? I mean, the king is pretty safe. But I feel like I should take with the pawn there. Hmm. Yeah, he does take. Okay. What do we want to do? I feel like f takes does allow pressure on the g file later on. This is currently controlled, but there's a good chance after a move like knight to d5, my opponent might have to give up his bishop anyway. If we take with the king, we keep the f-file open, but it's also a big hassle to actually do anything down the f-file. So I'm going to take with the pawn, which also means that this bishop has the liberty to move at some point, and then we can play the pawn to f4 to give this pawn some support. And because this bishop will probably get traded off later, there is a good chance we could use the g-file to invoke some kind of weakness. And it's not obvious how my opponent develops here. Not obvious at all. A move like knight to c6 is natural. We could play, well, knight d5 or knight b5 now that knight a6 couldn't be played. If knight a6 is played now, there's a good chance we take it and ruin the structure. There's also ideas of like rook e1 and e6, trying to expose my opponent's king, because it is quite weak. Although knight e7 might solve some of those problems. I think we are definitely better here. There's no question about whether we're better. Now, what we can't do is give my opponent too much time. Because if he gets like knight c6, knight e7 castles in, for example, sure, we can infiltrate to d7, but like, he's a lot happier there. We need to try and take advantage of the position while he hasn't developed his pieces yet. So that is exactly what we're going to try to do. I would love if this pawn was back on e4, because c7 would be very weak, but I suppose c6 could be played at any point anyway, to kind of strengthen that side of the board for my opponent. A move like f6 makes no sense, because I probably just push e6, or just leave the pawn there. I mean, in this position, it would hang the c7 pawn with rook to d8 threats, but I just mean in the future. Difficult for my opponent to move, though. Very, very difficult. A move like g6 doesn't really make sense because I'm going to get into the dark squares. He does go knight c6, okay. I think we should heavily consider the move knight to d5, but we should also consider the move e6. Now, my opponent can't queenside castle because my rook controls d8, which is very nice. I like the move e6 because we try to strip my opponent's king's defenses away, and also have ideas of bishop takes c7. If e6, what can my opponent do? Well, what if he takes? Bishop takes. Maybe this is a threat. Rook e1 is definitely a threat with discovered checks. It also stops my opponent from castling either way. But if here, my opponent can play knight f6, we do give him that square back. We could take on c7 though. That is a free pawn. Do I want to just be up a pawn? Well, my opponent can't castle. So that's really nice. That is really nice, actually. If e6, knight f6... Sorry, e6 takes, knight f6... Trying to think of the best way to go about this, because I really want to get this advantage going. Really grind this down. What about knight b5 first? Knight b5, bishop b6 seems like the logical move. I mean, you could play rook c8, but then after e6 takes, it's an issue. So it does bait the move rook c8, but what if he plays what I think is the best move, which is bishop b6? Don't expect your opponents to play bad moves, ever. Expect the best moves. Well, a6 does threaten to kick my knight out, but the move e6 means that a6 can always be met with knight takes c7, because my bishop now helps out. So knight b5, bishop b6, e6. Take. What if knight f6? Well, then the c7 pawn hangs. Rook c8 isn't playable. This looks winning. This looks winning. Let's go for it. I did spend over 2 minutes in that position. You could argue that I didn't need to spend over 2 minutes there, but I think it's a critical part of the game, because like I said, if my opponent castles and he gets his remaining pieces out, we are probably still better, but it becomes a much more difficult task to actually win the game. We need to try and win the game before my opponent can get his pieces out. So that's what I'm doing. I'm making threats, and I'm trying to advance my position. Every move I want to be a threat. This is what an initiative is in chess. We're going to work the initiative. We're going to play e6. Knight b5 threatens this, my opponent has to respond. e6 threatens this, my opponent has to respond. Also threatens this. This is essentially a double attack. Now, we could consider taking on c7 immediately, because you cannot take back, because knight c7 wins your rook. So what happens if we take straight away? Rook c8 cannot be played, because we take the bishop and then go knight d6 check and win the rook anyway. So bishop c7 threatens bishop b6, ab6, and knight c6. Sorry, knight c7 picking up the rook. So what can my opponent do? His rook can't go anywhere else. We said what happens if it goes to c8, and it can't go to either of these squares because my bishop will control those squares. e6 will always be hanging anyway. So this looks very, very good. I suppose my opponent could play king f7, defending e6 and stopping knight to c7 from coming with a check. We could play rook d7 check, knight e7 blocking, take, take, although we don't even have to include those moves. We could play knight d6 check. The king would have to go back to f8. That feels winning. I mean, at the very least, we can just take on e6 or take on b6 first and then take. So I'm going to do this. That looks incredibly interesting. Again, this is losing. This is losing. Moving any other piece is losing. So king f7 looks like the best try. Looks like the best try. But check. This looks like the only logical move. Check. I suppose the king could venture forwards. We could go knight back check here, check, and then we're going to take on e6 with devastating effect. So that's probably not good. It'll be interesting to see exactly which move order the computer considers to be the best. I think we have found the best way to attack my opponent's position, but we might be mixing the move order slightly from what is necessarily the best move. Like perhaps in this position, taking on e6 is a little bit more accurate for some reason that the computer will be able to better tell us in the post-game analysis. And that'll be really interesting. That's what you use the engine for. But I have a feeling that bishop c7, even if it isn't the most winning move, I know that it's winning. I'm cashing in on my winnings immediately, essentially. And I think it's probably the simplest way of winning this position. Ooh, bishop c5. That's something I didn't consider. But I mean, it doesn't help you. It doesn't help. I mean, I could just retreat the bishop and threaten this. But I guess he is covering the d6 square, so rook c8 could be played. I think that taking on e6 might be easier, though. I think this might be easier. We go up a pawn. We have threats of like rook e1 and discovered checks. That's a good find from my opponent. That is a good find. I didn't consider that move. We could play bishop. Well, no, maybe not yet. Let's take first. Let's take first. Let's do it. We're up a pawn now. My opponent, his king is very exposed. It's so exposed. He's kind of hanging on for dear life here. A6 makes sense. Trying to boot my knight away. We could play bishop d6. And it takes. Although then he gets into a2, so let's not give him anything. We could give this check. I don't think that accomplishes anything. I think knight d6 is the best way to go about this. Reason being, either my opponent moves his king, and I could take on b7, or I could play knight to... Well, no, taking on b7 attacks the bishop as well, so that's probably the best move. And the knight is very weak, the king is stranded. But he takes. And I think taking with the bishop, I think that makes the most sense. If I take with the rook, then the bishop feels a little bit flimsy. I might be making the wrong decision, but I'm going to take with the bishop because my idea is, after the knight develops, I just go rook to e1. And this is kind of hilarious. Look at the symmetry in this position. Like, the pieces are situated symmetrically, which is really funny. But the issue for black is, look at my bishops. The king only has 2 squares. And you can't stop my rooks from unleashing discovered checks. Now, do any of them lead to checkmate? I don't know. Knight e7 is a good move, blocking. but it doesn't work. I think bishop to just b3 is the best move. And the knight is pinned. If you play knight to g8, trying to defend the knight, I will take it, and then I will take the knight. And the knight, of course, can't come to d5, because again, I will take it, and this knight is pinned. So we're going to win a knight. And now the game is done. The game is completely done. We are going to clean up in the most accurate fashion possible. And then the analysis on this game should be very, very interesting. My opponent resigns, though. A very reasonable time to resign. Let's get into the game analysis. Let's see what the computer thinks of this. Okay, so the power of the Vienna shows again. We win with 87.3% accuracy. Not perfect, but let's see what the computer has to say. e4, e5. Knight c3, knight f6. f4. Taking is not good. e5. Like I said, queen e7, queen e2. The knight still has to retreat. And it's even worse. We have moves like d4, just expanding the center. And the queen is always in trouble. Always in trouble. Although, actually, I prefer the move knight to f3 here to stop queen to h4 ideas. But that's just my personal preference. Anyway, knight f3, bishop e7. And yes, d4 is better, because bishop h4, you can go for this line, which I was alluding to, and go king e2, and then the bishop controls the f4 square, so the bishop cannot get out. After something like d6, there is knight to e4 attacking the bishop, and if you take on e5, knight takes g3. If you take on d4, queen d4. If you trade the queens, white is up a piece for 3 pawns, which technically is an equal trade. But the issue is that white has so much development. Squares like g7 are going to be very weak potentially. Squares like c7 could be quite weak, and white is better. Also, shout out to the commenter who talked about this in a previous episode. Can't remember you like your name, but it was a really interesting line. I slightly misremembered it and went bishop c4. Bishop h4 check is a mistake. Apparently, I'm supposed to do this anyway. Oh, yeah. I analysed this as well. The point isn't to do this anymore, because this doesn't work, because the bishop has the f4 square. The point is to castle, and after g takes h2 to go king h1. And this is apparently completely winning. I forgot about this. Completely forgot. And now this attack is going to be really, really strong. I forgot I went king f1. Frustrating, but we're still winning. Bishop e7, d4, d6. We take on f4. D takes e5. And apparently knight takes e5 was better than what we did. Of course, we're threatening f7. Knight to h6 just loses a knight, because we'll damage the pawn structure and then take. So bishop e6, we have d5 attacking the bishop. If the bishop moves, we have d6 threatening once again. And if the bishop comes back, then of course we can just like take, and we're up a lot of material. I didn't quite appreciate this move order. I instead took with the d-pawn, but I think we got a very, very instructive game regardless. Rook takes d1, of course, bishop g4. h3 actually is the best move. I chose king f2, which isn't amazing. h3, if the bishop takes, it's not good, essentially. But we went king f2. Bishop c5 is a mistake because of king g3, which is the only move to actually keep the advantage for white. But bishop c5 is the most obvious move to play. You get your bishop active, and you prepare to get this knight out, so you can castle. The problem is king g3. You have to retreat the bishop here, which is what I was half expecting, and it's something like bishop e6, fe6. The e6 pawn might be weak, you know, knight g5, it's difficult to defend, you're going to have to move your king. Knight g to e4, no, sorry, knight g to e4, attacking the bishop, let's say bishop to b6. Then there's problems with your king's safety, you know, something like king e8, rook d8, and you're probably going to lose this game, because you're going to have to give up basically everything you have. But my opponent takes, knight c6, knight b5 is a very good move. You can play e6 immediately, so the computer prefers this move order slightly. like this. I chose knight b5, bishop b6. King f8 is the best move, but like, who's playing king f8? Computer wants e6 and just wants to give the pawn up and probably give that pawn up as well so that you can do this. Then if bishop b6, I mean, you're still losing. Still completely losing. But my opponent goes for the most natural move, bishop b6, and we play e6, which is the best move by far. Fe6 kind of has to be played, because if you play a move like f6 here, c7 is hanging regardless, and the king is in even more danger, and the knight, I mean, he can come to e7, but like, you know, bishop c7 you can't take. Computer wants king f8. Because, why? Well, I suppose this is threatened, so yeah, you have to move the king. Kind of like what happened in the game. Well, my opponent moved the bishop in the game, but you can do this, and if the bishop goes back, bishop a3 with threats of knight d6. That's very, very interesting. So you take. You kind of have to. And bishop c7 is the best move, so I'm very happy about that. We find the right move order. Bishop c5, very nice find from my opponent. I didn't see anything else for him, so this was a very nice defensive resource. We just take on e6. Rook he1 was good as well. a6 attacks the knight, but I mean, nothing works anyway. Bishop d6 is a move I considered, but I thought, well, why give him anything? This is great. Oh no, the rook's hanging. I didn't notice that. Okay, whatever. Doesn't matter. Knight d6 check. You kind of have to take. Knight f6 is played. You don't have anything else. I mean, rook d8 is the best move, but like, just rook he1 anyway. This king cannot do anything. It's literally stuck. Knight g to e7. There's just moves like bishop c5, and I mean, this is so weak. Black can't castle. Rook d1. Rook d1. Like, what's going on here? You're down a pawn as the black pieces. Your knights are tripping over each other. The rook can't develop properly. If it tries to come to f8, bishop d7, king f7, bishop c6, you can't take with the knight because the rook hangs, so you have to take with the b pawn. Rook d7, rook e8 is the only defense. And I just bring my king. You can't go back to f8 trying to break the pin because there's another pin, and if you come up to f6, I mean, worst case scenario, I could just trade everything on e7 and be up a pawn. Is that? It's probably winning. Let's say everything got traded. Yeah, because I'm so active. I'm so active, this is winning. But knight f6 is chosen, and after rook h to e1, I mean, it's nothing, but knight e7 makes our life very easy. We just drop the bishop back, and there's no way of defending the knight. Knight g8, you take the knight. You can't take with the knight because of the pin, so you have to take with the rook, and then I will take the knight. So there's nothing here. My opponent resigns in this position, and I can't blame him. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to drop a like and subscribe, and click the video that's going to show over here, because I think you're really going to enjoy it.